So this morning I would like to offer a single, simple observation about the story that we just heard read from chapter 8 of the Gospel of Mark. It is an observation that, if understood fully, I think you will find it very hopeful. Just very, very, really, truly hopeful. And if I do my job right, you might even find it a little bit inspiring, too. But also, at the same time, I'm afraid that it is also an observation you might find a little bit, just a touch, just a skosh insulting. But in the spirit of that old Confucian wisdom that the best medicine is bitter to the mouth, I want to go ahead and offer this observation to you nonetheless. So without further ado, here is my somewhat controversial observation for you this morning. We, that is me, that is you, that is Jesus-interested folks around the world, we, technologically sophisticated, world-wise, and connected modern people though we are not all that different from the original disciples. That is both a hopeful observation and perhaps a little insulting. And because in minister school they taught me that you should always end on a hopeful note, that means today we need to begin with how that could be considered a little bit insulting. So in our story today, Jesus and his disciples are again in Gentile territory. This time they are somewhere out in the wilderness, and we're told that a very large crowd of 4,000 Gentiles, that is non-Jews, have gathered around Jesus in order to hear him preach. Apparently, they've already been camped out there in the wilderness for 3 days, just kind of soaking in his teaching. As I personally like to imagine it, the whole scene has kind of a religious Woodstock kind of vibe to it. But at the point of today's story, their time together has come to an end. And before Jesus sends the crowd on their way, he expresses concern to his disciples that the people have run out of food, and that if he sends them home as they are, they might faint from hunger because some had traveled considerable distances in order to be there with him. However, there were no villages nearby where food could be easily accessed, and Uber Eats wasn't going to be a thing for another 2,000 years, so there was no obvious solution to this particular dilemma that they were in. So the disciples asked Jesus what is a seemingly pragmatic question. They say to him, how are we supposed to find enough food to feed them out here in the wilderness? Good question. Now, you and I, having just read this story, we, of course, have the advantage of hindsight. We know that Jesus is about to magically multiply some bread and some fish in order to feed the whole lot of them, and even have some to spare when all is said and done. But standing where the disciples are in front of Jesus before this miracle takes place, they have no way of anticipating what is about to happen. They have no way of knowing that something like this is even in the realm of possibility. They have no way of knowing. Right? 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 Well, wrong, actually. You see, while we didn't read it together in our own journey through the Gospel of Mark, this is actually the second time that Jesus pulls this exact same stunt in the Gospel of Mark. The last time he did it was just 2 chapters ago in chapter 6, where he performed the same miracle, multiplying bread and fish. But that time, it was for an audience of some 5,000 Jewish listeners who had turned out to hear him preach. So either it is that the disciples are just really dense and they can't wrap their mind around who Jesus is and what he was all about, or it is that they are just really prejudiced, and while they know that Jesus can work miracles, they can't wrap their mind around the idea that he would perform such a grand act of compassion for a group of non-Jewish people. Either way, the disciples don't come off looking too good. All of that notwithstanding, Jesus being the gracious teacher that we know him to be, he overlooks these shortcomings entirely. He pays them no mind, and instead, he just asks the disciples if they have any bread on them. A perfectly innocuous question, right? 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 You know the trick now? Wrong. That is not an innocuous question, because you see, back in the same chapter 6 that we were just talking about, Jesus also gave the disciples some very explicit instructions for what they were and for what they were not supposed to carry with them when they were out doing ministry. Specifically, he told them they were to take nothing with them except a walking stick. No traveler's bag, he said. No money and no bread. And yet, here the disciples are, 2 chapters later, with not just 1 loaf, but 7 loaves among them, presumably tucked up in their tunic somewhere. I don't know. I wouldn't be eating it personally. So not only are they dense and are they prejudiced, these disciples, these people who knew Jesus the best, his closest friends and confidants, they were disobedient even to his most straightforward commands. So to say that we are like the original disciples, then, is to say that we too fail to grasp who Jesus is and what Jesus was all about, despite being told time and time again. It's to say that we too are super prejudiced, and there are people out there that we think should be on the receiving end of God's love and God's compassion. It's to say that we too fail to obey even the simplest and most straightforward of Jesus' teachings and Jesus' commands. So you can see how the observation that we are like the original disciples, how that could be considered more than a little insulting. These are not necessarily people that we want to be lumped together with. But again, Jesus, being the gracious teacher that we know him to be, he does not take this moment to call the disciples out for their shortcomings, bountiful though they are. And instead, he tells the people gathered to sit there on the ground. He takes those 7 loaves of bread, those 7 questionable loaves of bread from the disciples. He gives God thanks for them. He breaks them, and he gives the pieces to the disciples. And the disciples walk through the crowd, dispersing these pieces to the people. And somehow, some way, we're told, the Bible doesn't go into length about mechanics. It just says somehow, some way, the crowd was able to eat in all they wanted, and that afterward, the disciples were able to walk through the crowd with baskets and fill up 7 baskets full of leftover food. So in other words, what happens in this story is that despite all of the disciples' shortcomings, despite their denseness, their prejudice, despite their lack of obedience, Jesus involved them, Jesus included them, Jesus used them, so to speak, in the carrying out of this miracle. Thousands of people were fed that afternoon by the hands of these very imperfect individuals. And what I really want us to take note of in the story this morning is that Jesus went so far as to take the bread that the disciples were carrying on them, the physical evidence of their direct disobedience of his commands, and he made that bread the centerpiece of this miracle. Which is all to say that the point of this story is not about Jesus being very good at cooking for a crowd, but rather it is about how God can take flawed, broken, and incredibly imperfect people like the disciples, like me, like you, and through those people, God can accomplish great works of love and mercy and compassion. God can accomplish miracles even through the likes of us. And that's pretty hopeful, right? Being like the disciples can be hopeful when we view it from that perspective. So in closing today, I just want to offer you an image to help you kind of cement this idea in your head. It's actually a story, one of my favorite stories. It's one I come back to often. It's a story about a guy named Edwin Landseer, who was one of the most renowned artists of the Victorian era. So Edwin Landseer, he was born in 1802, and he showed great promise as an artist even from a young age. When he was just 13, most people spend their entire lives trying to do this, but at the age of 13 years old, he had his first showing at the Royal Academy of Arts. And then as a young man, he was hired on multiple occasions to do portraits for the royal family. And as he got a little bit older, he actually became the favorite artist of Queen Victoria herself, and he was honored with knighthood in 1850. Edwin Landseer, he is best known for his masterful depictions of animals. If you are all familiar with London, if you've ever been to London, you may know that, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, in Trafalgar Square, there are these statues of lions. Very famous statues of lions. He's the guy who designed those, just FYI. But while he's best known for his animals, he also spent a good deal of time in Scotland, painting both its vistas and its people. But one day when he was out in the traveling around Scotland, he stopped in an inn for some food and some lodging for the night. And that evening, as he sat down there in the dining room eating his dinner at a table by himself, there was a fisherman and a fisherman's friend sitting at the table right next to him, and they were just telling stories, I suppose as fishermen do. And in the middle of one story, this fisherman, he kind of was gesticulating wildly, just as a woman carrying a teapot happened to be walking by, and this fisherman gestured, and he knocked the teapot right out of her hand, and it smashed up against a recently whitewashed wall. So it broke the pot, tea got all over the wall, and it left behind a really dark, kind of unsightly stain on the wall. The fisherman, rightly, I think, he was embarrassed, and he apologized profusely to the woman that he bumped into. The innkeeper, however, was furious that this wall that he had just paid to get painted was now a mess. Landseer, however, he stood up, and this is something that he was known to do. He stood up and he intervened. He said, I think I might be able to do something about this. And went back to his room, and he got some ink and a brush, and he came back, and he got to work. So in the main part of that stain, he made a body out of it, made for legs coming off. A bit of an upsplash there, it became some antlers. For good measure, he added some trees, a little grass here and there. And slowly what emerged was a stag. Not only a stag, a regal stag standing in a forested glade. What had been an ugly, unsightly stain on the wall had been transformed into a masterpiece. And while it's easy to think this is apocryphal, there's actually multiple stories about him doing this at various places throughout Scotland and the Scottish Highlands. But have no doubt about it, friends. When God looks at the wall of our lives, God sees every last stain, every last blemish, every ding, every dent. But rather than tearing down that wall for its unsightliness, rather than finding a better wall to lean on, what God does is God breaks out the ink and the brush, and God transforms those stains and those blemishes, those dings and those dents into a work of art, a masterpiece of love, of mercy, and compassion. That is what Jesus did in this morning's story. And thanks be to God, that is what God does every day of our lives if we're open to God's presence working in them. So though we may indeed be like the original disciples with their flaws and foibles and all, that is a very hopeful thing. Amen? Amen.